Okay. Thank you. Namaste. Namaskar. Good afternoon. There's a pretty eclectic collection of talks in this particular series. So I'm not very sure how this fits into the rest of it, but it might stick out like a sore thumb. I'm going to be talking about the rejection of Eurocentrism. I know this is a pretty combative title, but there's a reason why I've titled it so. Okay, if I can get this to work. Okay. Can you see what's going on here, Ashutosh? I'm not able to change it.
Yes, you can do that. From here?
It's not working.
Yes, this one.
Okay.
And this is also working.
And forget it. Okay. Right. So at the very onset, I'd like to clarify that every civilization has contributed to the progress of humanity, both locally and globally in varying amounts, and that's pretty evident to any student of history. That's pretty evident. However, today's Eurocentric worldview has effectively erased all non-Western sources of knowledge. And I'll demonstrate this to you to show how this mechanism has taken place. We also see the parochialism that Christianity came along with has additionally contributed to erasure of non-Christian sources of knowledge, and most spectacularly in Greece when the so-called pagan libraries were destroyed and so on. So in this talk, I'm going to highlight primarily erased Indian contributions to knowledge systems. So before I start, I need to define Eurocentrism. So Eurocentrism I define as a worldview or an interpretive framework that places Europe and, inverted quotes, the West, at the center of human history, knowledge, and value, portraying European experiences, institutions, and categories as universal, normative, and superior to those of other civilizations. What we see is it's an ideological orientation with European civilization as the origin of modernity, science, rationality, the standard by which all societies are measured, the culmination of human progress with non-European societies shown as static, primitive, or derivative. You only have to take any book on the history of science written by any Western author to see what I mean. They obligatorily will exalt the West. They'll obligatorily exalt some Greek figure or somebody else as a source of wisdom, and everybody else is not even a footnote in these things. So where does it come from? We see, especially if you see my talks, I have more than 300 talks on YouTube, so do search for my name, Raj Vedam, you'll see them. This will be more clear to you. The context of this statement will be clear to you if you see my talks. Greece learns from India directly and via Egypt and the Hittites from 1500 BC to 200 BCE. Greece was conquered by Rome around 146 BCE. Rome adopted Christianity in 330 current era and fell into dark ages for about 1200 years. Feudal Europe was marked by illiteracy, disease, superstition, backwardness. They were backward in math, medicine, astronomy due to the doctrines imposed on them. The clergy as well as the elite learned from the Muslims in Toledo and Sicily in the 12th to 14th century thanks to transmissions from India into Arabia and from Arabia into Toledo and Sicily. And with the fall of the Byzantines to the Ottomans, there was deep-rooted inferiority complex among the Europeans at that point. So to mask this backwardness, Eurocentrism evolved in the following manner. They borrow extensively on mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and sciences. They erase or rename sources to avoid humiliation, reframe history as Greek, universalize Europe's experience after colonial and industrial power was secured. And I'll show you instances of each of these things. So the erasure mechanism, one, in European historiography, the renaming and appropriation. So many examples abound. For example, calling Brahmagupta's famous equation as Pell's equation. Only problem, Brahmagupta lived 1,000 years before the so-called Pell and completely solved that equation, whereas Pell was not even able to solve any such thing. Neither was Euler and others to solve that equation. Hemachandra sequence, this in the 11th century or the 10th century was completely known, but later we came to be called Fibonacci sequence, thanks to the transmission that happened. Madhava, Kerala School of Mathematics in 1300s, who had the infinite series for pi that's appropriated as the Gregory-Leibniz series, and the so-called Pythagorean theorem was used in India thousands and thousands of years earlier than that. And even today, we see Vipassana has been packaged as mindfulness. So you see this continuing appropriation through renaming and so on. That's the first mechanism. The second mechanism is the so-called recovery narrative. They present medieval translation as recovering Greek thought. So there's an assumption that Greek thought existed. This was destroyed when Greece was Christianized, right? But that knowledge was preserved in other countries, and they are recovering that knowledge. And this is an outrageous title by a professor called David Pingree, who was in the Brown University. He passed away in 2005. He had the audacity to title his 76th paper in Journal of History of Astronomy as a recovery of early Greek astronomy from India. He had the audacity to say the only contribution of Indians to sciences is the preservation of Greek science. So you can understand where I'm coming from when I read papers like this. The third erasure mechanism is dating compression. We see that moving Indian achievements into time frames that make them derivative or contemporaneous with European epochs. One of them is Max Muller, who, using linguistics methodology, decided to date all of the Vedic literature. He stuffed them into 1200 BCE to 200 BCE, which does a grievous distortion on Indian chronology and so on. And moving forward, plagiarism and omission of citations. We see medieval translators omitted their sources to pretend Greek origin for Sanskrit to Arabic to Latin works. For example, Gerard of Cremona, who translated more than 87 texts at Toledo in around 1100 or 1200 and so on. And many of these were works by Indian authors. One famous example is the Toledan tables, today called Alphonsine tables. This was used by Copernicus, but then this is attributed to Aryabhatta. So Aryabhatta's tables that have come all the way over here. You see Avicenna's canon. Avicenna was somebody who wrote, translated Charaka Samhita into medical literature. That's how Europe got to know about these things. Then we see epistemic dismissal. The so-called greats, European philosophers like Hegel and Immanuel Kant and others, they were well aware of Indian epistemology, the darshanas and so on, and they dismissed it. They dismissed Indian philosophy even while they were borrowing their core ideals. So this is the worst case of appropriation that you can imagine over here, and this dismissal more or less entrenched European supremacy. So I'll give you a few instances before I close. I'm sure there's no time to go through all of these things of Eurocentric claims. The alleged fathers, right? Almost every history of science in the Western literature will trace their antecedents to Greek figures over here. Geometry to Pythagoras, whereas Baudhayana lived in 2800 BC talking about that. Trigonometry to Hipparchus, whereas Surya Siddhanta of 600 BC is talking about the sine function Jya and the cojia and things of this nature. And whereas Hipparchus had chord tables. Medicine to Hippocrates, whereas Shushruta, much earlier than him, and Charaka had their works. And we see surgeries attributed to Galen, the Roman, whereas Shushruta was much, much earlier there. Physics, atomic theories attributed to Thales and Democritus, whereas Rishi Kanada has already got this in Vaisheshika. Philosophy attributed to Socrates, whereas Kapila, Gautama, they lived much, much earlier. Logic to Aristotle, but Panini has already articulated so much more, even at a timeline at 800 BCE. So to debunk Eurocentric claims is a huge, huge project over here because so much has been layered over the years by colonial historians, Eurocentric historians, and so on. I've given you some samples over here. Origin of civilization is given. Eurocentric claims it began with Greece and Rome. Others were barbaric or historic. The reality is civilization arose independently. Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, and so on. Greece came much, much later, and there are several references for that. Mathematics, Western mathematics, so-called inverted quotes, begins with Greece, on to Renaissance, on to Newton. In between, there's a big void. Nobody tells you that they had no numerical systems, no zero, no decimal point, no place value. Imagine multiplying numbers with Latin numerals. So the decimal system, zero, algebra, trigonometry, calculus, everything came from India and later on transmitted Islamic world and through them to Europe. Several resources for these. The number system is today renamed as Arabic numerals, but these are European adoption from Arabic works, but these are really Indian, Brahmi to Nagari to Arabic to Europe, and Seidenberg is one example who talks about that. Second, astronomy, scientific astronomy begins with Copernicus and Galileo according to Eurocentric claims, but then we see pre-Copernican heliocentric planetary models in Aryabhatta, Bhaskara II, and so on. In medicine, Hippocrates and Galen are the founders of rational medicine according to Eurocentric claims, but we see Ayurveda, Shishruta, Charaka, and so on as much, much earlier than these. Chemistry is attributed to Robert Boyle and others, but then we see Indians had developed this much, much earlier. Philosophy attributed to the Greeks, but then we see Nyaya, Samkhya, and others are much, much earlier. Music and aesthetics, Western tonal music is all the apex of world art, but Indian Shastric music with the Nati Shastra, Datilam, these greatly predate European music. Printing technology, Gutenberg is attributed with this. However, movable printing type originated in China, including paper making and ink came from China to the European world. Navigation, Europeans supposedly discovered the world, but then far before them, there were Indians who were navigating the Indian Ocean and other places. History and chronology, Europe's dating of antiquity is constrained by biblical timelines dated to 4004 BC creation date and from there on. And however, we see much earlier chronologies are present in India in the Puranas, for example. Industrial and mechanical inventions, the Industrial Revolution is supposed to be a uniquely European achievement, but the precursors in textiles, chemistry, steel, hydraulics, clockworks, everything was from India that funded some of these things. Modern science is seen as Western, and supposedly it originated with Bacon and Descartes and with Newton, but then we are seeing experimental empiricism. This evolved through centuries of Vaisheshika and other things. That's how scientific thing came about. Linguistics and philology, comparative linguistics began with Europeans, for example, according to these claims. But then Panini's Ashtadhyayi is so much more earlier, and that is the reality over here. And concepts of modernity, apparently in the European Enlightenment era, secularism, industrialization. But then we are seeing non-European modernities, Indian urbanism, Chinese bureaucracy, Islamic rationalism, that was far before the Enlightenment, and that is not attributed here at all. So in conclusion, what we're seeing is Eurocentric assertions falsely exalt themselves, right? In any single field, they exalt themselves. Everything else is exotic, primitive, superstitious, and some dismissed in this manner. They have plagiarized, erased, and assert Indian achievements. Specific mechanisms, they appropriate by renaming Indian contributions. They use a recovery narrative, positioning Indian knowledge as lost original Greek knowledge. They compress Indian chronology that allows predating Greek works before Indian works. They follow plagiarism and omit citations to earlier sources from India. They have an epistemic dismissal while stealthily appropriating concepts from Indian epistemology. And we see that it continues to the present day. You see Western and Indian academia continue to propagate these falsehoods. Yes, yes. So that's the end of my talk. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any questions for Dr.